The views expressed in this review are my own. I encourage everyone to pick up a copy and read it for themselves. What I like, others may not, and vice versa. If you would like to read or critique my own work, I will leave a link in the description. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad you could be with me today. Orcs are not a fantasy race I've spent much time dwelling on, unless one of the artists I follow on Twitter happens to be drawing some. Today's book is all about the greenskins, as today we're reviewing The Black Crown by John A. Douglas. Without further preamble, let's get into the story, then the usual likes, dislikes, and thoughts. The story. The Orc Wars are at an end. It was a terrible chapter in Allspire's history, filled with all the usual horrors of a world war. A final battle has happened at the newly established and recently demolished Orc City, as an enemy army of every non-Orc race in power has come to finish the job. At least they will if the leading elf has anything to say about it. The whole war was started because the Orcs took the queen of a kingdom, and the elite, like they normally do, suddenly became aware that they weren't above the problems of the people they ruled. With a cry of, "That could have been me!" they decimated the Orc city and reclaimed the human queen. But as so happens in fantasy with orcs and women of literally any other species, the queen is pregnant. The Queen's King and the Elf King are ready to nip the little problem in the bud. The Human King for obvious reasons, and the Elf King for reasons that would make Poland a little nervous. The Queen is having none of it and carries the child to term. Skipping the painful questions of birthing a child with tusks, there are going to be some changes around this human kingdom. One, they're going to be held liable for the losses of everyone else in the war because it was this king's queen they went to save. And two, the Orc boy is going to be secluded in the library wing where no one can see him. That is, until the king can find some way to not be a stepfather anymore. That's where I'll leave off with the story, because it's a good place and actually barely touches the first chapter. Also, you will understand where things stand without too much in the way of spoilers. So let's get into my likes. First of all, this book is well written, which is impressive considering it's the author's first book, a fairly long book, and John A. Douglas is a budding YouTuber. By all rights, and all the experience I've had with books, this book should not be as well written as it is. The prose are some of the best I've seen for a first-time author. There are a few errors, I think I counted 3, but this is a book that took over a week to read. It may not kill an Australian spider, but it would certainly give it second thoughts. I wanted to mention this first because it's nice to see this level of prose in a first book. I didn't achieve it, and Lord knows most of the TikTok authors I read didn't achieve it either. Furthermore, it was clear. I had no questions about where I was and what was happening. I didn't have to double back to figure out what was going on. Moving on. I'm really happy this book didn't shy away from the more uncomfortable areas of its subject matter. The Orc Wars were a terrible time, and led to some terrible things. One of which is the half-orc situation. Orcs are a very tough bunch, and the same goes for their byblows. The half-orc children proved themselves resistant to this world's equivalent of the morning after pill. So, after the wave of tusked green babies, there was a lot of Moses-like situations minus the basket. The half-orcs who survived usually did so because they were born in certain temples that protected them, at least from the river fate. Not sparing the grim situation of the world lends a lot of weight to the villains, the King of the Elves being one such situation. He has made it his goal in life to erase the orcs from existence. He hates them with a passion that political movements hate other political movements who disagree with them on only one issue. That is to say, deeply, vigorously, and with a complete disregard for the other's sentience. This may have something to do with the hardiness of orc breeding, the fact that orcs enslave elves, and or the fact that they eat elves. The orcs for their part equally hate the elves. It's not for the reasons I would have thought. While the half-orcs hate the elves for their elitism and their constant work to keep the half-orcs as third-class citizens, The full orcs seem to have different opinions. First, the elves literally smell bad to them. Second, the elves are physically weak. And third, the elves have everything the orcs want. That being said, there's more to this world than just orcs. The world has the standard fantasy run of humans, elves, dwarves, and orcs. Our author is a connoisseur and gives us a minotaur-like race called the Aurochs, named for the now extinct giant cows of Europe. This is the race of one of the main crew called Valmora, whose existence is part guide, part teacher, and partly because I suspect the author wanted to have a horned, 8-foot-tall muscle mommy in the story. I'm not complaining, I'm just asking for fan art. Really, the world is a grab bag of different fantasy races living side by side, which does lend some richness, but I'll touch on this theme later. Let's talk about the characters. It's nice to have characters with faults. It makes them feel more real. Ragoth, our main character, who I will be calling Rags from now on, is a naive bookworm. At the beginning of the story, he completely lacks guile, is easily cowed, and hates to fight. He runs into Court, a human, muscle-headed former town guard whose first response is violence, and if that doesn't work, he applies more violence. Then there's Denny, an elf with no magic who's sworn an oath of servitude. To phrase another way, we have an orc that acts like an elf, a human who acts like an orc, and an elf that acts like a human monk. It certainly makes for interesting interactions between the three. That being said, the characters are clear, it's easy to see the difference between them, and they feel like actual people. Mostly. Since I like to split my last like among my dislikes, I'll cover what I liked about the plot. While there are some things I disagree with in the story, these aren't things that hurt the story. I have to applaud the author for not going with the conventional ways out. It started off with a hook that felt very generic, which I won't mention because it's kind of a spoiler. There's a lot of deceit that I kind of picked up on in the beginning, but I wasn't sure if that was the direction things were going to go. There was a lot of threads I was pulling against the further we got into the story, and what Rags set out to do starts to feel not only unlikely, but like something that doesn't fit into the world in general. That part is wrapped up rather nicely, and Rag's journey to Dreadmore is probably the best part of the book. So let's get into my dislikes. I want to clarify from the beginning of this section that none of these are story-breaking. I enjoyed the story as it is, but there's some things I didn't like about it. Getting back to the plot. The third act, as I call it, after Rags makes it to Dreadmore, is where things get a little wonky. After finding his father's people, Rags finds that they're pretty terrible. The orcs are slavers and enslave anyone who isn't a full-blooded orc. That includes half-breeds, or slags as they call them. Rags is put through the ringer, as is his unfortunate elf friend who God forgot to instill a survival instinct in. The orcs seem to imitate what they've seen other races do, to less effect. This somehow strikes pity in Rags' heart. He wants to improve their lot, but I see no reason why he should feel this way. The orcs treat him worse than almost anyone else, with the limited exception of the dragon that tried to eat him, and some of the assassins that tried to kill or cripple him. I understand why Rags would have sympathy for other half-orcs like himself, but with the exception of Rags' orc uncle, none of them care for him, and almost all would end him if given the chance. Let's talk a bit about the orcs in this story. In my opinion, the orcs probably deserved what happened to them. At one point in the story, we visit the lands where the orcs come from. It's a jungle and home to other sentient races who absolutely hate the orcs, and for good reason. They hunted and tortured the other races for sports. They ate them, and probably worse. During the Orc Wars, the orcs would show up out of nowhere, do a little struggle, snuggle, and pillage, then disappear when the armies would show up. Meeting an orc army is a good way to end up dead, eaten, or used in the oldest sense of the word. Their byblows can't be aborted, and their first response to anything appears to be violence. King Southen, I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that right, the Elder Elf King, wants to exterminate the orcs, and it's not hard to see why. Given their history, it's actually more jarring when a character outside the main group is willing to give Rags a fair shake. That being said, half-orcs have integrated mostly into common society, as far as being laborers and little else. The half-orcs have a rough time of things, but they don't show the threat that full orcs do. In fact, the orcs are such a threat, it's surprising to me the rest of the world doesn't simply name them monsters. That being said, it is later mentioned that the genocidal king of the elves lost a bit of support for his zealotry, which, given what the orcs are, I have a little trouble believing. The orcs were originally brought to the attention of the crowned pantheon, the leaders of this world, when a sorcerer king used them for his army. The sorcerer king was so powerful the gods had to act and smited him from existence. The orcs were his savage tools, and after the war didn't integrate into society. There's not a reason for anyone to feel empathy towards them considering what they do and how they act. I'm not saying they should try to rid the world of orcs, I'm saying I understand why they would want to. Keeping on with the theme of the plot. Some things in the third act bother me. Not to the point of ruining the story, more that they stretch believability. Trying to spare you the spoilers, because the book is worth reading, Rags has to retrieve something from a cursed area. He doesn't have a choice in it because gods are involved. He must do this to defeat a much bigger, full-blooded orc so that he can gain power. There is a series of victories that feel a little too quick, and Rag goes from unsure bookworm to alpha orc in very short order. I'm not saying this is unbelievable or even outside the story, it just feels out of place for a character who up to this point has gotten by mostly on his smarts. It's like a wizard running out of spells, then throwing off his robes to reveal a perfectly sculpted body, which he proceeds to use to beat the eldritch horror to death with. It's like the meme, I'm out of spells, not out of options. It's kind of funny in a meme, but is challenging in a story. Finally, in my dislikes, I want to mention that there seems to be an idea that Rags can redeem his father's people and make them better. In the end, he certainly has the tools to make the attempt. The problem is, he's made himself too big a target. I really don't want to spoil things, but let's just say he set himself up better than his father ever did, and there is no way the ancient king of the elves, who has a burning hatred for all things green and orky, is going to allow any of what this boy is trying to do. This man lost favor among his allies because of his zealotry. His compulsion to remove the greenskins from existence is so strong it literally turned off people who united to exterminate the greenskins. Even his own people, who the orcs ate and did worse things to, thought this was a bit much. The king has used everything from coercion to blackmail to gain control of the other kingdoms, and somehow he's going to allow the orcs to just reform into a civilization. I just don't see it ending well. So let's get into my thoughts. I really like a complex world, and for the most part that's what we're given. There are a few hiccups here, but mostly the world is consistent, and the reason for the various prejudices other races have for each other are fairly obvious. Really, the only other hatred I've seen was for the elves, mostly because they're fairly unpleasant and look down on pretty much everyone else. The humans appear to be doing what humans do, being fruitful and multiplying with every other race they can. Not much has been explored about the other races, but there is something that kind of bugs me about the whole thing. In this world, every city appears to be a melting pot of some kind. No one race has their own country, let alone their own city. And while that lends to a certain cosmopolitan feel, it does make it feel like a McDonald's commercial at times. This is a world that's well on its way to completely breeding out the different races. I can't disagree with the fact that if you put humanoids together in a city, they will intermingle, but the fact that every city is like this is kind of hard to believe. Without the borders, both physical and genetic, everything kind of blends together. Everyone gravitates towards the highest standard, and there's no differentiation in culture or craftsmanship. Granted, cramming in a bunch of other cultures and languages would have certainly slowed down the book and made things more complicated. Having hodgepodge cities takes away from what makes fantasy races special. Then again, I love fixating on details like this, and it's probably something that most people aren't even going to think about. I could see an age of adventurers where people of different races travel the continent, conquering challenges and becoming obscenely wealthy, leading to a world like this. But having studied human history, it doesn't feel likely to me. Lastly, I want to comment on the plot structure. Doing my best not to spoil anything. I'm not sure this was intentional, but I do like the twist in the story. Granted, I started to get suspicious quickly, and accurately predicted about 80% of them, but that may just be because I read a lot. There are some subtleties here that may bug some people. Much of it depends on Rags being who he is, but some of it being our current trend towards stories not being what they seem. I'd like to dive into that more, but I really don't want to spoil things. Final verdict, a little long, but it's as long as it has to be. Good luck, everyone.